In the aftermath of the 2016 election, Republicans controlled more federal and state offices than at any other point since the 1920s. Just 4 years later, Trump was the first president since Herbert Hoover to lose the White House, the Senate, and the House in just one term. The party turned winning into losing in record time. The aftermath has left the Republicans with deep internal divisions and substantial external challenges. How can the Republican Party keep and grow its coalition to potentially win back the White House in 2024? And how might these debates impact the party at the state and local level? Answering those questions and more is what we will work to unpack here with two political science professors, Dr. Michael Coulter and Dr. Caleb Verbois, as we ask, what is the future of the GOP and where will the Republicans go from here at the national, state, and local levels? Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan, I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson, and I am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Now, Dr. Michael Coulter is a professor of political science at Grove City College, where he teaches courses in political theory and American politics. He is the co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Catholic Social Teaching, Social Science, and Social Policy. Now, Dr. Caleb Verbois is a professor of political science at Grove City College as well, and an affiliated scholar at the John Jay Institute. He teaches American politics and political theory and specializes in American constitutional thought. For fuller bios on each, please do visit our website, jeserie.org, and head over to Grove City College's website at gcc.edu. And I can't think of two better professors to have here today to ask these questions to and to present to look at the national, state, and local implications. Now, folks, since this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're listening to or watching a later broadcast of this program, please still feel free to send us your questions to keep this conversation going. And for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, visit jeserie.org and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Coulter and Dr. Caleb Verbois to the JES Digital Stage. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us here today.
Good to be here.
Thank you very much.
So Caleb, I'm going to pitch over to you first. You're going to talk to us about the national implications. So let's hear from you before we then go to Michael.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Jefferson Educational Society for having Michael and I with you today. We've been looking forward to it. I primarily teach American politics, and my natural bent is think in historical terms, so maybe a bit paradoxical, but I want to think about the future of the GOP by starting by discussing its past, and specifically the past of conservatism, which is often, but not always, the intellectual driving force for republicanism. I think, as you alluded to in your intro, the results of the 2020 election give a good starting point as to where to go back historically, in that the Republicans just lost the White House, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. And that's the first time they've lost all three after controlling each of them in just one presidential term since Herbert Hoover lost to FDR in 1932. So if you're a Republican, consider the fact that after 1932, the Republicans didn't control all three of those again until the first 2 years of Eisenhower's term in the 50s. And Eisenhower, of course, just kind of barely a Republican. He'd only become registered a little bit before he ran for office. And then they didn't control all three again until George W. Bush's first term. On that evidence alone, the Republicans hope that history does not repeat itself in the future, because that's a long time to wait. More relevantly, though, I think for our purposes, from 1932 until 1980, the Republicans only controlled the White House for 8 years under Eisenhower, and then for 5 years under Nixon, and that didn't go very well. Right? Now, I think that there are a lot of reasons for this, but one of them is that the Republicans spent much of that time period consumed with political infighting between various factions in the party. Starting in the 1960s, though, a group of intellectual conservatives led by Frank Meyer, who was the editor of National Review, argued that what the right needed was to combine traditionalist and libertarian ideas together, partly on the argument they shared philosophical foundations, kind of the building blocks that undergirded their policy ideas, but mostly on the idea that they both really hated the American left. Now, even 60 years later, conservatives argue just about what this fusionism entailed. But I think as a summary, we can say it pretty quickly expanded beyond traditionalists and libertarians. It's often described as a 3 or a 4-legged stool, depending on who you want to include in it. And I think there are 4 groups. So the first is national security conservatives. The second are libertarians, small government, free trade thinkers. The third are deficit hawks. And the last are traditionalists. Now, sometimes this group is combined with social conservatives, although traditionalists and conservatives, social conservatives don't always agree. And this group is kind of perfectly encapsulated in Ronald Reagan and his presidency, because he speaks to all of these groups in compelling ways. Reagan famously liked to say that the scariest words in the English language were, "I'm the government and I'm here to help." And it's hard to think of something that better encapsulates modern libertarianism. Right? At the same time, Reagan could go to the National Association of Evangelicals and quote from memory from Scripture and C.S. Lewis. And it's been a long time since a Republican president do that. And of course, no one could credibly accuse Reagan of being soft on communism. Perhaps only the deficit hawks could really complain about Reagan, because of course the debt went up by 3 times during his presidency. But the deficit hawks haven't gotten very much in the last 40 years. Right? What I'm suggesting is that over the last 25 years after Reagan, this coalition theoretically continues to exist, but practically it breaks down in some important ways. It breaks down visibly because it ceases to be a means of securing a political majority. George Bush wins in 92 in 88, excuse me, on Reagan's coattails, but then loses in humiliating fashion 4 years later, partly as Ross Perot siphons off huge numbers of voters from this coalition. George W. Bush wins twice, but only once with the popular vote, and just barely in 2004, 50.7% of the vote. In fact, those 92,000 popular vote wins are the only Republican majorities since Reagan. It also breaks down, though, in more theoretical ways. If this coalition of traditionalists, social conservatives, libertarians, and others is conducted intellectually, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. As in very obvious ways, social conservatives and libertarians are often at odds, and national security hawks and deficit hawks don't go well together. So more of a marriage of convenience, a way to kind of cobble together an electoral coalition. But if that's what it is, you would expect all of the parts of the coalition to get something out of it. But if you think about it, they really haven't all gotten equal levels of things. In the last 40 years, national security hawks have gotten a lot. We've fought a lot of wars in a lot of places most Americans can't find on a map. Right? Deficit hawks, though, they haven't gotten very much. In 1960, the national debt was $286 billion. In 1988, it was $2.6 trillion, and as of about a month ago, it was $28 trillion. Right? So nobody has been responsible on the debt. Libertarians maybe haven't gotten their utopia, but they've gotten a whole lot of what they wanted: vastly reduced taxes, vastly reduced governmental regulations, massively increased free trade, and relaxation of drug laws. Social conservatives and traditionalists, though, while they've had a lot of say in judicial nominations, it's hard to pinpoint a whole lot of legislative wins. Right? It's hard to tell what they've got in terms of actual legislation from their 40 years of support. Right? And so what I'm getting at here is that this alliance has shifted from being purely transactional to defining what conservatism is. Lower taxes, less regulation, more support for the family, more support for religion, more guns, less debt. That's what conservatism is. But some of these goals are pretty clearly in direct competition with each other. And I think during Bush and Obama's presidencies, that split got bigger, especially on economic lines. And that combination really helps explain the rise of Donald Trump. On the one hand, there was a lot of real discontent among a large portion of the Republican electorate that its leaders just missed. There are a lot of intellectually minded thinkers in the GOP coalition, and they assumed that their voters thought the same way about philosophy as they did. Take, I think, free trade as an example. Right? In the long run, free trade is better for almost everybody. More people get jobs, goods cost less, the standard of living rises. But the long run can be really, really long. And the pain from free trade, from factories going overseas, is really localized and is one that our part of the country is really familiar with. And that difficulty can be long lasting. Right? In this sense, the libertarian side of the party was disconnected from the interest of traditionalists and social conservatives. Like, if all you care about is growing the economic pie, who cares about jobs moving overseas? Just get a better job somewhere else. But if you care about people being able to live in a community, raise a family, about the ability of parents to find dependable work, then all of those things matter a lot. Moreover, outside of trade, the issue that's most motivated Republicans is probably cutting taxes. Like if you look at the last 4 Republican presidents, like the consistent thing is that they all do something on taxes. And a lot of this is based on the belief that cutting taxes would have sort of a trickle-down effect to regular Americans to help rising tide lifting all boats. But the average salary of men has been basically unchanged, adjusted for inflation since 1958. And I think Donald Trump tapped into this in a way that before him, only Ross Perot and a few people like Rick Santorum, who's a former Pennsylvania senator, ever really had. Trump also spoke to a group on the right that's long dreamed about running government more like a business, right? Well, that's probably not ever really worked, but there's a lot of people that really wish that it would. I think this explains how he won the primary in 2016. He tapped into some real anger on the right, right? It does explain why he won the general election, though. Right? I think 2 things are necessary there in addition. Right? First, Trump was really able to speak to men, and especially men working in blue-collar jobs, in a way that nobody has in decades. And he shifted them meaningfully from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And second, Hillary was really, really unpopular, especially with Republican-minded women, which often convinced them to kind of hold their nose and vote for Trump because they didn't like Trump for other reasons. On the flip side, part of the reason Trump lost in 2020 is that his campaigns and his presidency pushed away many female voters. I think there's another issue with Trump, though. His rhetoric was different, and he campaigned as a different kind of Republican. But in terms of actual governance, it was kind of more of the same. Right? Trump campaigned on fair trade deals, border security, and repealing Obamacare, but he didn't really do very much of that. Right? By the end of his presidency, his administration had built just 15 miles of new border walls, despite that being kind of a central element of his campaign. Right? Instead, his signature legislative achievement is cutting taxes, right? Which makes him about as typical of a Republican as you can get. Right? Now, this is supposed to be about the future of Republicanism. And so to think about that, I'd like to show, and Ben, if you could pull it now, this graphic of voters from 2016. And when you look at this graph, the y-axis is the vertical line. And this vertical line measures social liberalism. And also economic. The vertical line measures an economic dimension, and the horizontal line measures a social dimension. How far you are sort of on socialists. So you go all the way to the left of the graph. If you go all the way to the left of the graph on economics, you're basically Bernie Sanders, right? Karl Marx, AOC, somewhere in there. If you go all the way to the right, you're Andrew Carnegie or Ayn Rand. Right? If you go all the way to the bottom, Planned Parenthood, and all the way to the top, and you're basically Robertson. Right? Think about the graph in that kind of way. Right? Now, most people fit somewhere in between those extremes, but focus on the clusters. That bottom left quadrant is very full and consistently voting for Hillary. That's folks socially liberal and economically liberal. We can drill down further and we can see that most of them are going to be urban voters or maybe suburban voters. If you look to the bottom right, the first thing you notice is that like nobody's there, right? Well, what is this quadrant? This is the Libertarian Quadrant, right? This is no total free markets, no social rules, no legalized drugs, everything else. This is a really loud corner of the internet, but it has very few voters in it. You look to the top right, that's economically and socially conservative. That's almost uniformly for Trump, and theoretically where the bulk of that sort of Republican fusion movement lives, right? But it's also pretty clear visually that that's a smaller group of voters than Hillary voters on the bottom right, the bottom left, excuse me. And so what that means is that the deciding vote is that top left corner, right? These are socially conservative voters that are more economically liberal. And you can see in the 2016 election, visually, this split leans towards Trump. And I think this shows part of where the fusion coalition breaks down. There's a lot of traditionalists, a lot of social conservatives, and blue-collar workers that live in this quadrant. And they want to vote for Republican social issues. They're predominantly pro-life, for example. They believe in traditional views on marriage. They also want a more activist government on economic grounds. And I think this explains the 2016 election. It also explains in partly the 2020 election. Trump didn't win in 2020, partly because people don't hate Joe Biden as much as they hated Hillary, partly because COVID making people generally unhappy, but partly because Trump never tried to expand his coalition to different people. But I think this is where Republicans need to look if they want to win in the future. The right side of this graph is lower taxes, more trade, and more immigration. The left side of this, the top left of this graph, doesn't really want that. It wants more stability, safer jobs, and permanent communities. And the question for Republicans is, can they speak to both of those groups? Right? Because if they can't speak to both of those groups, they either need to find a different coalition or get used to not winning. Right? Because even putting all this together in 2016, they didn't win the popular vote. And Trump was only president because he squeaked out an electoral college vote in 4 or 5 important states by about 40,000 votes. It's not really a repeatable circumstance, right? You need a different kind of circumstance, a different kind of coalition. And this doesn't even touch on the ongoing wounds in the Republican Party from 2 impeachment trials, one of which is still going on, a riot that broke into the Capitol, and QAnon, right? Part of the job of a political coalition is to bring a political party is to bring people into its coalition. A part of its job is to define as outside of it people that are welcome, right? So you might say for a political party, hey, we want to bring in families, we want to bring in hard workers, we want to bring in citizens, but we don't want racists, we don't want sexists, we don't want conspiracy theorists. Right? Why? Well, because if you have all of those people, and some of the other people you want are going to leave, right? Kind of got to pick, choose what you're going to have as a party. And I think the Republican Party is really struggling with this. Right? Just yesterday, Liz Cheney, the 3rd ranking Republican in Congress, and one of the few who publicly voted for Trump to be impeached, had to defend her position in the Republican caucus, as a number of members wanted to be removed from leadership. Now, she won re-election overwhelmingly in a move that I think shows some of the loudest members of the House GOP, the Freedom Caucus, often overestimate its own board. But on the same day, Kevin McCarthy, the House Republican leader, punted on the opportunity to remove Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a freshman congresswoman who's perhaps the biggest supporter of not just Trump, but QAnon in Congress, and who has made a remarkable number of offensive and at times kind of crazy statements. In other words, he chose not to choose what to do. And that, I think, is a really good description of the Republican Party right now. It's choosing not to choose what kind of party it wants to be in the future. 2020 Republican Party platform didn't have a platform, right? Instead, it just chose to be loyal to Trump. That doesn't bode well for figuring out how you're going to win back the electorate in the future. And so at that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Coulter.
Caleb, I want to thank you for that. I just stopped sharing my screen so we can kick things over to Michael. Now that we've gotten a look at the national, Michael, take us to the state and local and what we can look at there with the future of the GOP.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be a part of this event. And give me just a second to pull up my screen.
And Michael, while you're doing that, I'll remind folks tuning in, we're taking the questions, your comments in the comment section below on this Facebook page. We've already got a couple, so thank you, folks. Keep them coming. Now we're going to turn our attention to state and local levels for the future of the GOP. Michael, over to you.
Sure. So again, great to be a part of the program today. Caleb talked about some of the ideas that held together the political party and the challenge of getting a set of ideas that can appeal to a winning coalition. I mean, that's what political parties have to do. And so I want to pick on a few issues sort of directly related to at the state level. And so first, I want to make this point that state parties, or the political party in a given state, varies because citizen preferences vary across states. So I grabbed just a simple chart, and this is just all of the states listed, and the main thing is just from left to right is sort of liberal to conservative, conservative to liberal, pardon me. And the idea is that, look, different states have different degrees of policy, liberalism, and conservatism. And a national party, you can win in certain states with a certain message, but to win nationally, you've got to craft a coalition that can win across enough states that you can win 270 electoral votes, right? So it has generally just been understood that among party leaders, there's going to be some diversity or variation within a party. The Massachusetts Republican Party is going to look different than the Georgia Republican Party, and party leaders knew that had to be, and they had to build a kind of coalition large enough. And we've had, in fact, we still do. We just had a Republican governor in Massachusetts. So it's possible for Republicans to win in some of those states. And it used to be for a long time that you'd have like liberal Northeastern Republicans and conservative, particularly conservative Republicans from the West. And then you had liberal Northern Democrats and conservative Democrats. And that's how the parties tried to form winning coalitions. Now, and even within states, there's an attempt to have something of a big tent, even though, the Massachusetts Republican Party is going to be more liberal than the Georgia one. But even both of those state parties are going to try to include, as many sort of to build a winning coalition. And so what parties don't do, and I just picked 3 headlines that I grabbed quickly here. These are not what I wrote. This is just what some newspapers presented is. So in Arizona, the state Republican Party censured a former senator, the current governor, and the wife of a former senator, right? So with Jeff Flake and Doug Ducey and Cindy McCain. This is really unprecedented. And it is really like sending the signal of anyone who's not sort of completely committed to Trump is not part of the party. And that makes it incredibly difficult to build a broad coalition, right? You can have idea, or you can have commitment to an individual, or you can try to build a party large enough, right? South Carolina Republican Party censured Tom Rice, who was one of 10 Republicans who voted to impeach then President Trump. And county parties in Wyoming have censured, which is really just saying we disapprove of what Lynn Cheney did with her impeachment vote. And that sends a signal to people who are not absolutely committed to Trump, right? That they're not welcome in the party. Sometimes it also sends a signal to independent voters who may not feel a strong affinity for either party, but might be willing to vote for the Republicans for a general election candidate. So, if from a very practical standpoint, these are bad short-term moves if you're trying to win elections, right? If you want to feel good about criticizing somebody's position you don't like, that's fine, right? And but it doesn't help you win elections. Right? And that's what parties need to do. Okay. So then I want to raise a second question is, well, what about a third party, right? This was raised of having maybe a Patriot Party, and this poll was taken, a little more than a week ago. And it seems that some Republican voters are open to the idea of a third party. It's actually quite amazing in this that more 2020 Trump voters were supportive of a Patriot Party in this poll than they were of a Republican Party, and then of just Republicans in general. That's unusual, and it's hard for me to think of a direct parallel to within a single party breaking away. I think you'd have to go back to something like George Wallace in 1968, where you have Southern Democrats who could break away from the larger Democratic Party. But here's the challenge, right? Starting a third party is really difficult, right? And I doubt that Trump wants to do this. Maybe some of his supporters do, but it takes a lot of time and money to do this. There's a significant infrastructure that the parties have in terms of party organizations and party headquarters and all that. So what I did is I just picked an example from our area. So what would have to happen if you would want to run as the Patriot Party candidate in the 16th Congressional District of Pennsylvania, so the district in which we're in? So Pennsylvania state law, it's a little complicated, and I hope I can make this clear, requires that you collect 2% signatures from 2% of the people, or the number of people who voted in the last election. So Mike Kelly got 210,000 votes, almost 211,000. So somebody who wanted to be the Patriot Party candidate in the general election in 2022 would need 4,218 signatures. That is a very difficult task to do. And they'll just repeat this in congressional districts across Pennsylvania. A candidate for governor. I mean, to be a successful party, you'd have to have candidates not just at the top of the ticket for president, but I think you'd really have to draw people over running in state house and state senate and other kinds of races. And Pennsylvania is about sort of the middle or median point of difficulty to organize a third party. There are some states where it's a little easier, like Wisconsin, and there are some states like Georgia where it's really hard to get on the ballot as a minor party. Okay, so the second point is, like, for the Republican Party, there's this possibility of it breaking into, in terms of two parties, right? I don't think that's going to happen. It's very difficult, but it could. And it wouldn't surprise me, even if Trump doesn't do it, that you see, some breakaway groups try to field their own candidates around the country. It wouldn't shock me. And it wouldn't shock me, like in Wyoming, if a kind of third-party Patriot candidate or something like that ran against Lynn Cheney. So I doubt it's going to be fully organized, but even if it's partially, realized, I think would have a detrimental effect on the Republicans as a whole. So here's my example of sort of splitting the party in a general election. Is that and this is a separate poll, and this asks, like, in the 2024 election, if there were a Republican candidate, a Democratic candidate, and a Patriot Party candidate. Now, again, this is taken just a couple days ago. A lot can change between now and 2024. But it's kind of shocking to me that more than half, or like not quite more than half, but like the Democrats got 46%, so they vote for the Democrat. But among people who, you might Republican and Patriot, more went to Patriot than to Republican, 23%. Now, what would happen in this scenario is there's zero chance that a Republican or the Patriot would win the presidency. And that's why this probably wouldn't happen, is because people wouldn't invest their political resources when they had no chance of winning. So like if the Republican Party splits, it's not going to, highly unlikely that you have a very successful Patriot Party or something like that in the short term. And it would be harmful to both of those efforts, or certainly to the Republican Party in the short term. So I think that's my last slide. Yeah, but I'll stop share. But my general point is that at the state and local level, right, that the parties have to think in terms of, the National Party has to think of having a broad enough coalition that will allow them to win at the national level. And as Caleb pointed out, the party as a whole has not won the national popular vote only once since 1992. And Republicans have to take this as a real challenge. They can't just dismiss it and say that we can still win in the Electoral College. That is, if they want to be successful. And then state level parties, I think, if they're going to be successful, have to think in terms of reaching not just voters who are loyal to Trump or Trumpism or whatever that might be, but voters who can win a coalition. And then to take it one more practical to Pennsylvania, and I think I'm about out of time, is like, so Pennsylvania faces a gubernatorial election next year and a U.S. Senate seat, the one currently held by Pat Toomey. If they pick a candidate who's sort of too purely Trumpian, let's like Lou Barletta, who ran for Senate previously and didn't come close, and Barletta really fancies himself as a kind of Trump-like candidate. It could be hard for someone like Barletta, who may not, obviously doesn't have the name recognition and the kind of connection with voters that Trump seems to have. Like, he could lose, and so the Republicans could lose if they pick too narrow of a candidate, both a gubernatorial seat, which would be unusual, the governor's office, and a Senate seat. So I think those are my sort of very practical state and local comments, and I think we now have some time for questions.
We do, and Michael, thank you for that. Thank you for going through a look at the future of the GOP on the state level. And Caleb, you set us up there on the national level prior to that. And there's plenty to unpack and pull away through this. And Michael, I'm going to stick with you for a second and take one of the things that Caleb had said and have you react to that. I think the way you phrased it, Caleb, was that Kevin McCarthy, the Republican House leader, chose not to choose. That seemed to be a tone-setting moment for me if I was thinking of what is the tone of the Republican Party right now. So, Michael, I want to turn to you. What is the tone of the Republican Party right now, today? We're here on February 4th. It will inevitably change. I think parties do change and they move when we're talking about coalition building as part of what you've discussed. But right now, what is that tone? Is it choose not to choose, or is it something different? How do you see it?
Well, Kevin McCarthy clearly does not want to choose to, I think he thinks it's problematic for him in the short term to sort of push out somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert from Colorado. That like the tone of the Republican Party overall, and I think this is where McCarthy senses it, is it's not with Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney and Jeff Flake. That is kind of the bulk of the party in terms of in terms of what seemed, the sort of median Republican voter wants, is closer, maybe not to Marjorie Taylor Greene, but it's closer to Jim Jordan, from Ohio, or like the more Trump-like and Trump-supporting members of the House and Senate.
So it's not the extreme polls, it's somewhere in between. And if I'm hearing you correctly, it's a little bit more toward right now the Trump-like candidates.
Right. And I think that's kind of the center of gravity of the Republican Party, is sort of more like Trump-like candidates. But I think that poses a problem for winning in some states, and I think it poses a problem for winning in the 2024 election.
And Michael, I'll stick with you for a second, because you had that slide up that talked about the headlines that you grabbed, the ones in Arizona, taking a look at the local party there, the state party, censuring candidates from Flake, a former senator, to looking at Sidney McCain, the wife of former Senator John McCain, and the current governor. And so we see the shadow of Donald Trump still cast on the party. How long is that shadow? Is it going to be with us for a while, or are Arizona, Wyoming, and South Carolina more anomalies when we look at this at the state level?
Well, I think we need probably one or two, or maybe even 3 cycles. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2022 if Republicans nominate, and Republicans will keep winning some states. They're going to. There's a strong Republican advantage, obviously, in places, like Wyoming or someplace like that. But if Republicans lose some seats that they could have otherwise won, perhaps with a different candidate, let's say Republicans lose the Senate seat in Pennsylvania, for example, then you might have some people saying, no, we need to step back and build a different kind of coalition. But so I think, and then you're going to have to see who's going to win the Republican nomination in 2024. Usually it takes a couple of 2-year cycles for parties to kind of really assess where they are or build a different coalition. So, or to, because there are people who still argue that, and it is true that Trump got 74 million votes, and the party won some House and Senate seats that they didn't expect to win, and the Republican Party still controls, I think 27 governors right now. So, the party has its challenges, but there are still some strengths, and people might try to rely upon those existing strengths.
And thank you for that, Michael. Caleb, I want to go over to you, and I'm going to take one of the audience questions right now. Caleb, you had that graph up showing us where voters tended to be on that XY axis, and seeing how coalition building might work. This person is curious, where do the evangelicals go? Are they going to gravitate toward a Trump-like candidate, or do they go to a more traditional GOP candidate? That is, where is that voting bloc headed? Because that's somebody that Trump had. Where do they go next?
Yeah. So I think it's a good question. It's difficult to answer. I'll try to answer and define some terms at the same time. So I that graphic only shows you so much, right? But for the most part, I think your sort of our typical conception of evangelical voter is going to fit on the top half of that graph, but cross the y-axis, right? And a lot of them fit in that upper left quadrant and not in that upper right quadrant. I do think that, something like 74% of self-described evangelicals voted for Trump in 2020. It was a little bit higher, I think, in 2016. I think there's an ongoing dispute in evangelical circles about sort of how far to follow along with a political candidate. And definitely there were a lot of evangelicals that liked, in the same way that a lot of sort of other Republicans did, that Trump was a fighter, right? That he sort of hit back and that they liked that. But there are other evangelicals that said, that doesn't seem like maybe the most important character quality for political figures that evangelicals should think about. I think it's hard to predict. What I would say is, my sense is that older evangelicals are much more closely aligned with Trump than younger evangelicals are. There's a pretty strong difference between sort of boomers and millennials, or the iGen now. How that plays out in the next couple of years is more difficult to tell. If I had to guess, I would say that over the next midterms, next round, unless something significant changes, the boomers are likely to vote in large numbers, and younger evangelicals are less likely to vote. But that, I don't have a crystal ball. There's only so much I can predict about that.
I think Larry Sabato has one down at the University of Virginia, or at least that's what he calls it. Caleb, I'm going to stick with you.
He's one of my old professors, and he almost does.
So, Caleb, I'm going to stick with you for a second because you covered the history, and I think it's so important to look back to understand how to look forward, and especially when we're trying to look forward and understand the here and now. Have we seen this before? This being the impact of a one-term president who lost his re-election bid on his political party. Have we seen this historically before?
I think in space there are some comparisons, right? And so I'll start with one that's not quite what you asked. I mean, I think that there's a lot of comparisons between 2016 and now, and say the 19 teens with, we actually have a third party run at that time. So we've got, Taft as the incumbent Republican in 1912. Woodrow Wilson runs as the Democrat. Teddy Roosevelt comes back and says, you know what, Taft, you're not doing a good enough job. Taft was his prior VP, and he runs against a progressive. And then Eugene Debs runs as a socialist. So it's a four-way race. And actually, the end of Wilson's administration, it isn't one term that he loses everything, but by 2020, like the Democrats are in control of everything in 1916. And in 2020, they get destroyed, right? And they completely disappear. And the key, historical indicator that I think is relevant is they don't come close to coming back until the Great Depression. They're like, the public decisively breaks from the Democratic Party. They say, Woodrow Wilson lied to us. He covered up things. He made it too hard. Like, he shut down dissent during World War I. He got us into a useless war. The Treaty of Versailles was terrible. And the Republicans campaign on a get back to normalcy campaign. And they win overwhelmingly, and they stay there till 32. And that has some real parallels with some reactions to Donald Trump in the last few years, and Joe Biden campaigning on let's just get back to normal politics.
And Michael, do you want to jump in there and weigh in? Have we seen this before? What have you studied?
I want to add something to Caleb's comment about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party at that time period. In particular, the Democratic Party had a challenge post-Civil War, is building a coalition to help them win the presidency. That is, they did really well in the South. They did well in some of the sort of middle states or sort of border states, but they had a hard time building a national coalition. And one of the issues was a difficulty for them is they had lots of supporters of prohibition, but the problem is if you move away from prohibition, they might lose some of those supporters. But in order to gain some supporters in northern cities and some northern states, they needed to drop prohibition. Right. So prohibition became this, like, if they held too tight to it, they couldn't expand their coalition. And if they moved away from it, it was a challenge to building or expanding their coalition. It wasn't a net negative. So the Democratic Party was in kind of a difficult spot, and it helped that the Republican Party kind of had its own internal fights that enabled some of their success, Wilson's success.
Yeah, and if I can jump in here, I think there's some parallels between that and Kevin McCarthy's problem right now. And Kevin McCarthy's problem, it's partly political, it's partly ideological. I mean, I think he generally identifies more with Trump, right? But he's pretty clearly concerned if he steps too far away from Trump and Marjorie Greene and others, that he's going to lose support and maybe himself be primaried. But if he doesn't give room in the party for Liz Cheney and others like her, like there's a lot of Republicans or a lot of people that would identify as conservative that just maybe they won't start a third party, but they might not vote, right? And I think all of Michael's points about a third party being really hard to start are valid. But even if there's not a third party, everybody doesn't have to choose one of the two parties. It's possible for people just not to vote or to show up and vote for some seats and not others. In fact, I think that may be, part of the explanatory variable in the fact that, Trump lost the 2020 election, but Republicans did better than expected in the House and the Senate, right? Some percentage of voters showed up, voted for Republicans in the House and Senate and said, look, I can't vote for Trump this time. Maybe I did last time, maybe I didn't, but this time I can't, right? And I think that also sort of pulls against some of the electoral fraud claims, right?
We see that on both sides. I was going to say we see that on both sides too. Even in Erie County, when Trump won in 2016, down ballot, Dems did well. They did well. Trump won the top ticket, but Democrats didn't fare poorly down ballot. So, gentlemen, I want to take it to a new direction. I want to take it to the media, and I want to take it to an audience question we've got here. People are wondering about the effect of the media on Donald Trump, especially in the end of his term, the lead up. And it says, is it possible that Trump had been driven into some sort of fit toward the end? That people cannot deny that no president, this person is arguing, no president was ever attacked on a daily basis by the media like Trump was. How do we respond to that? Because the media is such an important part of this conversation and its treatment of the Trump presidency in the moment and now afterwards, as we're still talking about Donald Trump. So did you see that attack on Trump as something that drove him into a fit? Please give us some insight. Michael, if I could start with you, I'm going to head to you first.
Look, Barack Obama had lots of critiques, from particularly from the conservative media. Donald Trump had a very supportive, you could hardly imagine a more supportive media organization than Fox News. Sure, MSNBC had, sort of 24-hour-a-day criticism of Trump, but they also had a much smaller audience than Fox News. I don't think he was, I'm not sure. I don't think Trump was the most attacked. I think there's probably lots and lots of attacks on both Obama and Trump. But we remember when somebody attacks people that we like, right? I think we remember those more than somebody who attacks, someone who's not of our party.
And Trump's not the first president to have a rough relationship with the media or the press. So we can go far deep into history to see that. We can see Teddy Roosevelt in media. We can see Thomas Jefferson in media. Caleb, do you have anything to take away on media before we turn to another topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd look to Bush Jr., right? George W. Bush had a very rocky relationship with the media, especially in his second term, where there were a lot of journalists like actively calling him a fascist. It's just sort of amusing looking at that 16 years. It's obviously a false claim about George W. Bush, but those claims are made all the time. Beyond that, I think I would say I'm not sure, like if the questioner is asking if the media was rough on Trump, broadly speaking, I'd say yes, although I think Michael's right. There were broad corners of the right media that just loved Trump and were really never very critical of him. But the second part of the question is, could it have driven him into a fit? And I think my answer there is, I'm not sure that I see a change in Trump's behavior between 2015 and 2021. Right, I think he's very consistent, right? That consistency could be a virtue, it could be a vice, right? But there's not really a change. I mean, Trump's brand is hitting back at people and winning, right? That is his brand. I think that what changes at the end of 2020 is that he loses. And that the more he becomes aware that he's really lost, the more desperate he gets. There's been lots of great sort of stories about White House conversations between Sidney Powell and others and Donald Trump in the last weeks of his administration. That's not media driven, right? That's personality and character driven. Are you capable of dealing with loss?
And to that point, I think one of the only times, I agree with you, Caleb. I think, who Trump was in 2015, riding down the escalator, was who he was at the end. There wasn't much character change that we saw. I think the only time we saw a real pivot was Charlottesville, and where he offers an apology and acknowledges the moment. And then because it's not received the way he would have hoped, he then reacts to that. And from there, I don't know that we see much pivoting off of the Trump course for Donald Trump as a person. One more audience question I want to get to here. And this person is, and Caleb, I'll stick with you for this one first and then pitch to Michael. This person's looking at, because we've acknowledged that the platform of the Republican Party was no platform, that they were going with the idea of a person in Trump. And this person's saying pick 14 or so points and identify that as the party: First Amendment, Second Amendment, personal responsibility, national service, etc. And they're saying the last thing on earth we need is a third party. Presuming they're speaking on behalf of the Republican Party, their thoughts. How do then we shift from the idea of it's a people first party of pick your person and get behind the personality and shift back to positions and policy? How does that happen, Caleb?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I think part of it, actually, I'd say, tagging on with the last question from the other viewer, I think part of the reason that the Republican Party became such a personality-driven party is actually the right media, right? The right side of media, that is Fox News, Newsmax, One American News, Talk Radio. There was a real shift from, the beginning of the 2016 primary, where a lot of them talked about Ted Cruz or Rubio or Bush, to once Trump was the guy, there was very much a move in lockstep with him. And here's the thing, he's not president anymore, and he's not on Twitter anymore. He still has lots and lots of supporters. That sort of daily pressure to be on the right side of the guy isn't there anymore. We've already seen Fox has started to move away in some directions. I think some others will. As that happens, that sort of opens up some oxygen, right? I think we have a whole different conversation about like whether or not Fox News is a good thing for Republicans, right? I actually think you could make an argument that it actually hurts the Republicans' ability to reach out to other people. They're always trying to reach out to Fox News. I think that shift can take place, but I think Michael's right. It's going to take a while. Right. And I don't think actually there is a ideation, like an ideological or a policy center to Republicanism. I think that there's some deep splits. Right? Even thinking about say think tank groups in DC, Republicans talk about needing the middle class, right? Whether it's Heritage or AI, Cato, all these big groups, when they talk about needing to help the middle class, they then often pivot to, yeah, we really need to provide help to families that make like $150,000 a year. That's not middle class, right? That's upper 5%, right? Middle class is $45,000 to $75,000 a year, family of four, right? And there's a real lack of awareness of that on the intellectual side of the right. I'm not sure that gets fixed anytime soon.
Michael, your reaction, how do we get policy points? Is there a playbook that the Republican Party can work toward to say this is what we build around rather than a cult of personality?
Parties typically, after they lose, they try to look back and say, where did we seem to lose votes compared to previous elections? And I think if Republicans were to look back now, they'd say, we lost some ground in suburbs around major cities. So here in Western Pennsylvania, Trump did very well. And if we were only looking from this perspective, we'd say, don't change a thing. But if you look at Montgomery County or Bucks County, or those, Delaware County around Philadelphia, those are that's probably explains the difference in Biden winning Pennsylvania as opposed to Trump compared to 2016. So you think, why did those voters, or why did some of those areas seem to shift from Republican to Democrat? And what are the policies and what are the style that might appeal to some of those voters? And then you also have to think about like the shifts, demographic shifts in the population, right? So how am I appealing to more suburban voters, or even, cities are growing still. And it is great. We want to reach out to as many voters as possible, but there aren't as many rural voters as there once was as a percentage of the entire population. And so Republicans have to not forget about, cities. And likewise, Democrats have to not forget about, rural areas. But parties have to not look to just their base. Parties have to be thinking about how they can expand or recover parts that were previously part of their coalition.
So I want to shift to a different topic again, because I know we're short on time here. We're almost out of it, but I want to keep you to as long as I can, because I'm having fun. This is fascinating. And I think this is really helpful in trying to understand the trajectory of what's ahead. One of the things we had looked at in the recent future, we had mentioned the Georgia elections, the Georgia Senate election. Which frames this better? And I'm going to throw it as a toss-up, and I'll let whoever wants to answer it first jump in. You can talk over each other. I know it's bad Zoom etiquette, but which frames this better? The Democrats won Georgia, or the Republicans lost Georgia?
Both.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I answer. I'll say Democrats won, just to be different. And that's only because they were a little bit behind after the general election. So you might say there was a slight advantage for Loeffler. That it should have that the Republicans Senate candidates should have done better. But I could see taking both sides makes sense.
Caleb?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think the Democrats certainly overperformed, which is to say that they won. They've improved their coalition. They've improved their get out the vote efforts, all those sorts of things that state parties need to do to be successful. And at the same time, in an ordinary year, when you don't have Republicans coming to the state of Georgia saying don't vote to punish them, right? The Republicans get more votes, right? I mean, it was sort of it was surreal to watch, right? The Republican Party knew they desperately needed to win at least one of these seats, probably two. And for 5 weeks, we had ads and people going to give speeches in Georgia to conservative Republican voters saying, don't vote for the Republican candidate to punish other Republicans to make them support Donald Trump, right? Like, the logic of it needed, I don't know, magic to work. But the whole thing was surreal, and very clearly, that doesn't have to reduce turnout very much to change the result of the election, right? There's another way of saying, I don't know, it's 6 years is a long way off, but I would think both Democratic candidates would be underdogs next time around. So,
Caleb, I'll stick with you here on a question, a tougher one that I think needs to be acknowledged and unpacked here at the end, because we talked about it earlier briefly. The insurrection attempt on January 6th, how does that weigh in on the future of the GOP? What do they do with that now? And Michael, I'll come to you next and ask about the impact of Trump's second impeachment on the GOP, because those are very much live wire issues right now. So Caleb, what impact does that have on the GOP right now?
yeah. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out what impact it has on me. Like, I was astonished watching, right? Like, completely astonished. To me, watching that was the most surprising political event I've watched since 9/11. Completely and utterly stunned. And I think, actually, had impeachment votes started right away, you actually would have had a lot more Republicans in the House vote to impeach, right? But the fact that they had sort of a week to think about it, maybe, or to be told it wasn't as big of a deal, changed things a little bit. I think that it's going to have a permanent impact on a lot of people, right? I mean, that it's very hard to excuse seeing a bunch of people riot into the Capitol, beat Capitol Police with American and Confederate flags, and break into the House, right? I mean, that's saying that, in 4 years of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee never managed to do, right? And yet, basically, a riotous group of people directly after a Trump speech were able to do it. It's the sort of thing that I think back to, National Review in the 60s, back in that time period, like Bill Buckley was an important enough figure in the conservative movement that he could say to the John Bircher Society, the racist group, you guys are out. We don't want you in the party. Right? I think part of the problem now is there's nobody with that sort of stature in the party who's also willing to say, you guys out. We don't want you in the party. And I think as long as that happens, it's a drag on the Republican Party results, right? They can still win elections. They can still campaign that the other side is worse, and so vote for us. But it's going to be really hard to put together like an honest, enthusiastic coalition because it's a kind of cancer in the party. Yeah, I don't want to mince words about it. Like, it's a terrible thing.
Caleb, I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate you not mincing words, because this isn't something I had the same reaction. I thought I felt like I was living through 9/11 again. And already I can remember where I was and who was texting me and how we watched it unfold on TV. And for me, that hadn't happened since 9/11, and I feel like I'm with you. I agree. Yeah. Michael, to you, if you want to talk about January 6th, please do. But I'm also interested to hear your take on the impact of impeachment on the GOP.
So first, January 6th. I think, right now, lots of, unfortunately, in many ways, lots of Republicans are not, like one survey of Republicans, something like 70% of them didn't blame like Republican Party officials for encouraging or facilitating, the insurrection. So a good chunk of the party isn't deeply bothered by it, right? Or isn't ready to punish members of the party for it. There are a small, a minority of the party, sort of like the Liz Cheneys and Mitt Romney and Jeff Flake, those types. So I think it will have an impact on a minority of the party, but in a country that's very evenly divided, you lose 10% of people who strongly identify with your party, you're going to lose a lot of elections. Again, you're not going to lose them in, I don't know, Montana or maybe Texas or someplace, but you might lose them in North Carolina and Georgia and places like that. I also think it has an impact on voters without a strong attachment to either party. So independent voters, of which there are not a lot, but an event like really impactful events can shape people's perception of parties for several years. Right? And this could be an event like this. Now, I think what happens is how the impeachment, or well, really it's the Senate trial to assign a kind of political punishment. It's kind of hard to express that shortly. I mean, the president's already been impeached. But so will the Senate vote to say that the president, is sort of barred from office in the future? Really, I think that's really what it comes down to. I think it depends on how the trial unfolds and if there's lots of evidence that's discussed, and then in light of that evidence, like if it's a quick procedural vote, 55 to 45, 55 vote to assign a penalty, and so doesn't meet the 2/3 threshold. I don't know if that sort of changes the present situation. But if it's a long, sort of dragged out, set of hearings, and we see, well, maybe we learn evidence of how much closer we were to like real harm to members of Congress, right, or coordination or something like that. I think that could further sort of shift public opinion from people who don't criticize the event. So it depends.
Yeah, if I could just tag on at the end there, I think that you're right, Michael. It depends on partly on how this evidence gets brought out, because there's a lot of evidence that's come out in the last month about how things were planned, how they proceeded, how close some of the insurrectionists were to Mike Pence and to members of Congress. And frankly, I think a lot of the American public just isn't aware of this. But an impeachment trial is front page, first thing on the television news as long as it goes. And in sort of an odd way, I'd say the Republican Party could get more out of a detailed impeachment trial than the Democratic Party could. If you think about it, the Democratic Party practically benefits from Republicans continuing to be split on this for the next 8, 10, 15 years. But if actually, sort of a clear-sighted, clear-eyed view of the evidence, you might end up with a Republican Party that's much less split on it. So there's some sort of perverse incentives there for both parties, I think.
And Caleb, final question, and Michael, I'll ask you to weigh in on this too, because I know we're a little bit over what we promised with time, but I have one more, and one person in the comment section says this conversation gives them hope for the GOP. So in spirit of that, and giving this person hope, and I'm grateful for that comment, thank you. And thank you too. I want to pick up right there with the evidence, with the idea of evidence and the idea of what truth plays in all of this, because Caleb, you used the word cancer in terms of what had happened for the insurrection, and that immediately triggered in my head, Mitch McConnell saying that the embracing of conspiracy theories by Marjorie Taylor Greene was loony lies, and it was a cancer for the Republican Party. So where does the party go here on truth in being able to find a strong figure to stand up, like you just said, like with Buckley, to stand up and say, if you don't agree with the truth and the evidence, even though if it's uncomfortable, you're not with us. You're not part of who we are because we embrace the truth. How do we get there?
Yeah. So that's really interesting. So, so every year in Western civilization, which is a course that we require all students to take, we have students read I have students read by Alexander Solzhenitsyn called the Gulag Archipelago, from his book, The Gulag Archipelago. And I have him read a section of it where he's talking about the effect of the Gulag on the Russian people, right? So the Gulag, of course, are the concentration camps that the Soviet Union keeps in place for something like 80 years. And he calls it a cancer, right? He says it's like 5% of the Soviet Union, but it affects everything. And one of the things that he says it has a powerful effect on is that everyone has to live by lies. They have to live their whole life by lies, because to tell the truth is to potentially give yourself a death sentence. And I think that it's not quite the same thing in America. We're not living in a post-apocalyptic world. We're not in a totalitarian regime, but there is definitely a real fear of telling the truth. And I think, on the right, you get a lot of, like, part of Trump's appeal was that he told the truth even with, in the face of political correctness or something. And there's problems with political correctness run amok. But now it's hard for Republicans to tell the truth about insurrection. It's hard for Republicans to tell the truth about QAnon, right? There's reports that some Republican members of Congress didn't vote for impeachment because they were afraid their family would be killed, right? So I think, Solzhenitsyn's answer is you have to have courage, right? You have to have a willingness to say the truth, even when there might be a cost to it. And I do think the Republicans that have done that, right? I mean, I think Liz Cheney's one. I think Sass is one, obviously. I think Mitt Romney is one, but there aren't very many. I think it's entirely possible that we won't know if they can win on this until we get into the next primary series for 2024. And that's a long way off, right? But at some level, the voters are going to tell the Republican Party what they want to hear, right? Do we want to hear truth, or do we want to hear something that makes us more comfortable?
Well, before
some political figures have to take some risks, right? Sorry.
So, no, Caleb, I thought you were finished there. Go on if you've got more.
I was going to say they have to decide, am I going to be willing to take a risk? Like, to say, I think if I tell the truth, voters will support me, right? Or I think if I choose not to choose, voters will support me, right?
And we'll see that. We'll see elections bear out on that. I'm fast forwarding to my schedule here in 2023, and I know I'm free on the 4th of February, so I'm going to bring you two back so we can have this conversation then to talk about that. Michael, final word goes to you. The role of truth and embracing truth for the GOP, how does that impact the future? Where are we headed?
Well, I'm glad that my colleague took that question first, because that is a big, hard question. And I'm glad that somebody got some hope out of this discussion. We could all use some. I think it's going to, I think, unfortunately, we're not going to know this really, certainly until at the minimum, maybe 2023, 2024. And if we see if there's a kind of candidate maybe that could draw together, a bit of the old Reagan coalition, but also expand it. Like, there's no way to kind of simply resurrect that old coalition, but maybe someone who's willing to kind of take on criticisms of, some parts of the current Republican Party element, but in a way that also expands it. Maybe like a bit like Ben Sasse. I mean, I think that's been part of his. He wants to kind of speak to sort of, even rural Americans, but also in a way that kind of, reach out to suburban voters. So, and Sasse has been both supportive of President Trump on some policies and supportive of of policies on, you might say, on very conservative positions, but he's also been willing to criticize. And that may be too hopeful to think that kind of approach could kind of recenter the party to build a national coalition. But that may be where the hope lies.
Gentlemen in the comment section, folks are saying impressive and thank you. So I think our audience is saying they don't want to wait until 2024 to have you back sometime soon to the JES digital programming stage. But Dr. Michael Coulter, Dr. Caleb Verbois, political science professors at Grove City College, thank you so much for lending your insight, your knowledge, your expertise, and talents with us here at this digital program.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having us. This was fun. We should do it again.
It was fun. Let's do it again. And a big thanks to all of you tuning in, watching along, your questions, your comments, keeping us going, keeping this conversation moving. We appreciate you. Gentlemen, for folks looking to connect and follow up on some of the work you might be doing, I know we can point them over to jcc.edu. That's the Grove City College website. Is there anywhere else that we would like to point them so that they can follow along the work you're doing, plug into the things that you're plugged into?
You can find our both of our contact information on the Department of Political Science at Grove City College on that website.
Wonderful, Michael. Thank you for that. And for more information about upcoming JES digital programming, please do visit jeserie.org. There you're going to find videos of other past presentations available to stream on demand, publications, including reports, essays, and timely writings, as well as information on all upcoming things JES. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Speg, and be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.